book is a literary history of a relationship between Tsarist Russia and two of its largest subcultures, Jews and Ukrainians. And the book, in many ways, is an attempt to propose an alternative to the Russian literary canon. Canons are great for blowing things up, but they're a blunt tool in war, and they're also a blunt tool in literature. And so rather than viewing Russian literature, Yiddish literature, and Ukrainian literature monolingually, I propose that we actually view them for their intersections, for what they have to say about one another, for how they have influenced one another. So the book is focused on the margins of the Russian Empire rather than the center. It's a place where people tended to meet at marketplaces and fairs rather than at operas and balls. And I'm focusing on the writings that are produced in this region of what is now Ukraine that overlapped with what was then the Pale of Jewish settlement. And I have a map for you on your handout, which shows the shifting borders of this region. This map is roughly from around 1900. And you can see the shaded area is what is now Ukraine, and this big dotted line outlines the Pale of Settlement. So this is the region where Jews and Ukrainians tended to live together. They tended to meet at markets and fairs. And the people living in this region had to negotiate cultural, economic, and geographical boundaries of the Tsarist Empire. The historical framework for the whole project is 1829 to 1929. A period that almost overlaps perfectly with the period of time that the Pale of Settlement was in existence. And this is the region where, for those of you who are unfamiliar with the Pale of Settlement, where Jews were forced to live in the Tsarist Empire. The Pale of Settlement, the borders were redrawn several times, but roughly existed from 1835 to 1917. So why did I start in 1829? This was the year Nikolai Gogol wrote his first widely read short story, Sirochinskaya Yarmarka, or the Sirochintsy Fair, sometimes translated the Fair at Sirochintsy. It serves as a kind of proof text for all of the writers that would come after him, whether they were writing in Russian, Ukrainian, or Yiddish. You've probably heard this quote attributed to Dostoevsky that we all came out from under Gogol's overcoat. Well, he got it partly right. Everybody came out from under one of Gogol's garments, and this includes Russian literature, Ukrainian literature, and Yiddish literature, probably some other literatures as well. But the garment wasn't the overcoat that Akaky Akakyevich wore in Shiniel. In the overcoat, it was the red cloak, the Krasnaya Svitska, that the devil wore in Sirochinskaya Yarmarka. And I'll tell you this story, I'll retell the story briefly in a moment. So I end the book project in 1929, and the reason I end in 29 and not in 17 is that 29 was the year of collectivization under Stalin. And I see this as the time when what I call in the book the commercial landscape came to its official end, at least as it had functioned in the pre-Soviet literary imagination. The writers I include witness collectively, not each one of them, the Polish uprisings of 1830-31, the reforms under Alexander II, including the freeing of the serfs in 1861, and of course the banning of Ukrainian literary publications in 1863 and 1876. The first wave of anti-Jewish pogroms, which took place under Alexander III in the early 1880s, and then, of course, the Bolshevik Revolution. So it's a period when Russian policy itself was becoming increasingly defensive. As the historian John Ledon has put it, by 1830, when Russia had consolidated its hegemony, it could no longer afford to take risks. So these writers that I'm talking about were negotiating what was rapidly becoming a kind of fortress empire. Well, the Pale of Settlement, with its ethnic mix of peoples, was at the borderland of this fortress empire, and it was a porous zone between Greater Russia and what lay beyond it. The fairs that took place in this region were a kind of quintessential embodiment of this porousness. To writers in this region, this porous commercial landscape where things could filter in and things could filter out was actually incredibly dangerous, whether that was because of the threat by outsiders to Slavdom or to the Russian Empire, or to outsiders by the Russian Empire who happened to find themselves there. So the book itself, as a whole, deals with a whole spectrum of Ukrainian, Russian, and Yiddish writers, from Ivan Kotlяревsky, to Nikolai Gogol, Hryhory Kvitka Asnovianenko, Mendeley Markers Forum, Sholem Aleichem, David Bergelson, Peretz Markish, and Isaac Babel. I am only going to focus on two of these writers, Sholem Aleichem and Nikolai Gogol. What I really want to focus on is how Sholem Aleichem reads and reworks the writings of Nikolai Gogol for his own purposes. I'll make a brief digression to Gorky, just because, one must always make a brief digression to Gorky. What I want to convince you of today is that whereas Gogol warns of the risks of introducing foreign material into Slavic culture from the outside, Sholem Aleichem warns of the dangers presented to the Jew as perhaps Russia's perennial other by that very landscape, by that Russian soil, that imperial Russian soil. Sholem Aleichem is critiquing those elements of Gogol that reflect the fortress empire mentality, while exalting other elements of Gogol, like his humor and his irony. So go ahead and turn to the first quote on your handout. And it's a long handout because I wanted to print them in Yiddish and Russian as well as in English. I'll mostly cite them in English. In Russian literature, the names of Gogol and Turgenev will live forever, for the former was a satirist and the latter a humorist, and both were great poets. Our poor Yiddish literature, too, has its humorist, Abramovich, and its satirist, Linietsky, of course on a smaller scale. Well, Sholem Aleichem is best known in the U.S. for his Tevye stories and for Fiddler on the Roof, which came out of his Tevye stories. And he wasn't only influenced by Russian writers, but through imitation, and Sholem Aleichem really was an expert at imitation. His Yiddish prose, I think, can be read as an interpretation of Russian literature, and also in some ways a critique of his Russian and his Yiddish models. Well, in general, scholars have always noticed the similarities between Sholem Aleichem and Gogol, but they've been content to limit comparisons between these two writers to anecdotes and isolated plot lines. And I think this has happened for a couple of reasons. First of all, we get back to that blunt tool that the canon is. We usually go about literary scholarship by looking for connections within a single linguistic or cultural tradition rather than across traditions. Second of all, the differences between the two writers' ideological and social agendas frustrate our efforts to equate the two. However, I think the differences between these two writers' ideologies actually is precisely what allowed for a modern Jewish canon to emerge from under Gogol's, not overcoat, but krasnaya svitska, red cloak, from his Ukrainian-Russian nexus. So reading Sholem Aleichem through the lens of the commercial landscape reveals Gogol's strong influence on him. Both writers portray this landscape as a microcosm of the Russian Empire. The Jewish Enlightenment, or the Haskalah, which took place during the half-century that separated the two of them, empowered Sholem Aleichem not only to rework Gogol's themes for a Yiddish audience, but also to reclaim Gogol's Jews for his own purposes, correcting stereotypes about the role of the Jew in the Ukrainian borderlands. And this is a role that's often conflated with the role of the vendor and sometimes with the role of the villain. Well, Sholem Aleichem may use Gogol's themes, but his Yiddish storytelling persona is in some ways more in keeping with some of his Yiddish fictional predecessors. One of them is his older contemporary, Mendeley Morker's Forum, Sholem Abramovich. Furthermore, in his critique of anti-Semitism at the turn of the 20th century, he's actually in dialogue with a number of his contemporary revolutionary Russian language writers, including Maxim Gorky and Vladimir Korolenko. These are social reformers who hoped for a change in the relationships between Russia's coexisting ethnic groups, relationships that had grown particularly troubled in the late 19th century. So Sholem Aleichem is constantly synthesizing the work of his literary idols and integrating them into his own project. Well, let's first turn to what I consider to be the founding text for depicting interethnic interaction in the Ukrainian borderlands, and that's Gogol's Sorochinsky Fair. It's worth noting, I think, that when Sholem Aleichem was writing, I'll sometimes refer to him, I'll try to call him Sholem Aleichem, but I'll sometimes slip up and refer to him as Rabinovich, his real name. But when Sholem Aleichem was writing in the 1880s, 90s, and early 1900s, the Sorochinsky Fair was one of the most popular of Gogol's works. It has since been eclipsed by Dead Souls and The Overcoat. Well, in 1829, Gogol brings his readers to his birthplace of Sorochinsky, and he does this by throwing a fair. You can look at quote 2 on your handout. Since morning, the endless string of ox carts with salt and fish had been making its way along the road. Mountains of earthenware pots, packed in straw, bumped slowly about, annoyed, it would seem, at their confinement to the dark. Well, the Soroczynski Fair is a kind of crucible for Ukraine's hybrid peoples and products, and it presents Gogol's native Ukraine as a familiar home for his Russian readership. Let me just briefly recall the story for you, since it may be a while, or some of you may not have read it. The story starts as a love story, and you actually have two heroes. You have Paraska, a typically beautiful Ukrainian beauty with black brows and black braids and a beautifully embroidered blouse. She looks a little bit like all of Gogol's characters. She looks a little bit like a puppet. In fact, she sort of looks like a pot, one of the pots that her father, Cherevik the potter, is maybe carting into his fair. She too is on this cart, and she's beautifully painted and decorated, and she's going to the fair for the first time with these other artistic objects. And Hrytsko, a handsome young man in a white coat, sees her and shouts a compliment at her and shouts an insult at the ugly stepmother riding alongside her. He says something like, "You must be 100," or something like that. Anyway, and then he throws mud at the stepmother. Hrytsko and Paraska meet later amid the aisles of wares in the marketplace. They very quickly fall in love, and they immediately decide to get married. Rather hastily, I would add, but it's a folk story. So they decide to get married. They quickly convince Paraska's somewhat dim-witted father, Cherevik, the potter, of consenting to the marriage. But of course, Hivria, the stepmother, will have nothing to do with this mud-slinging youth, calls off the wedding. And the rest of the story involves Hrytsko's heroic and very crafty attempts to try to win back his future bride and father-in-law. And he does this with a frightening folktale about a devil, a Jew, a red coat, and various other marketplace things gone awry. And we'll get to this in just a moment. Hrytsko kind of orchestrates the telling of this internal folktale. Hold on to that thought. So Sholem Aleichem, for his own purposes, set many of his own stories in the fictional town of Kozrilivka. And this is a town that he modeled on the Yiddish his childhood town of Voronkiv. But he actually calls Voronkiv by its own name, Voronkiv, in his autobiography, which he wrote in 1913, From the Fair, Funem Yalid. And this is a work that, like the Soroczynski Fair, renders the author's birthplace into a kind of collective memory space for his readers. You can look at quote 3 on the handout. "A man, as he travels to the fair, is full of hope. He himself does not yet know what bargains he'll manage to swing and what he'll manage to fix. He flies there swift as an arrow at full tilt. Don't mess with him, he hasn't got the time. But when he travels from the fair, Funem Yalid, he already knows the deals he's swung and what he's fixed up there. And now he doesn't fly so fast. He has time." Erhot Zeit. So by setting his autobiography at a provincial fair, a space that's familiar to both the geography and the literature of the Russian borderlands, Rabinovich, Sholem Aleichem, provides a stage for the interactions taking place in the rapidly changing Jewish geography of the Pale of Settlement. Well, the mass immigration of close to 2 million Jews from the Pale of Settlement to the United States between 1881 and 1914 meant that Sholem Aleichem was not alone in leaving this metaphorical fair. Well, there are several similarities between Sholem Aleichem and Nikolai Gogol that I want to call your attention to. Both were born in small towns in the Ukrainian territories, and if you have good eyesight or good glasses with you, you can actually see they're very close together. We have Soroczynski, and about 200 kilometers to the west of Soroczynski, Voronkiv. So they're quite close together. They both were relatively assimilated to Russian culture, although Gogol was born into a Ukrainian family. The family certainly spoke Russian at home, although his father wrote in Ukrainian. And Sholem Aleichem was born into a Jewish family and certainly grew up speaking Yiddish. Sholem Aleichem would speak Russian with his children. And they both also sort of served as exporters of folk tales from the provinces to wider cosmopolitan centers. Nikolai Gogol, when he was around 20, would make his way to St. Petersburg, which is where he would test his wings as a writer, and would begin publishing there. Sholem Aleichem would publish in venues in Petersburg, Warsaw, and New York, among other places. So they were both exporters from this cute fair. And I say cute, with what are these called? Scare quotes. So Sholem Aleichem had a kind of fraught relationship to the Russian language. He had begun to try to write in Russian and had decided that he was going to be much more successful in Yiddish. So it could have been that he too would have written in Russian if circumstances had been different. Well, the multiple ethnicities living in this territory led to tension in both writers' comedy. But whereas Gogol, in his Ukrainian-style stories, focuses on Ukrainians, Sholem Aleichem in his Yiddish stories would focus on Jews. Nonetheless, Gogol would decorate the outskirts of his stories with Russians, Jews, Poles, Gypsies, and Sholem Aleichem would do the same thing, sort of the outskirts of his Yiddish stories. Well, in the Sorochinsky Fair, Gogol's Paraska, the heroine, wanders through the aisles of wares, marveling at the mix of ethnic types. And you can look at quote 4. She was extremely amused at how a gypsy and a peasant smacked hands violently after a bargain, crying out from pain, how a drunken Jew slapped a woman on the backside, how arguing fishwives hurled abuse and crayfish, how a Russian, a Moskal, stroked his long goatish beard with one hand while with the other, ... So the seemingly unlikely mixtures lent a comic hybridity to Gogol's texts, which were sexual in their overtones. Well, this was a Judeophobic era, and Nikolai Gogol's Jews are often the most morally ambiguous and often ridiculous characters in his texts. But this did not stop Sholem Aleichem from borrowing Gogol's memory space for his own stories of Ukraine. In fact, he even fashioned himself very, very intentionally after the Russian writer. And you can take a look at the picture of the two of them. In fact, if I hadn't labeled them, you might not be able to tell the two apart. Sholem Aleichem mimicked the successful Russian writer with his Shakespearean bob. Sholem Aleichem actually had portraits of Gogol as well as his older contemporary Abramovich or Mendeley hanging in his key of study. He labeled a box for his work in progress Gogol. He called it his Gogol Kestel. Gogol was sort of a model for Sholem Aleichem to develop his persona as a writer of the people. So for Gogol, the Ukrainian fair is a memory space, and it's a stage on which ideal provincial characters fall in love, encounter a dangerous material influence by the outside world on the Russian Empire, whereas for Rabinovich, for Sholem Aleichem, his Jewish readers who were rapidly emigrating from the Tsarist Empire or migrating to large cities were beginning to see the Ukrainian fair as both dangerous and also a kind of strangely sanctified space, newly sanctified space for collective memory. So there was a little bit of the Gogol purified space in it, and there's a little bit of the opposite of what Gogol was doing in it. However, whereas Gogol includes Ukraine and Russia in a kind of vision of a united Rus in his later works, Sholem Aleichem is increasingly convinced that Jews needed to leave, if not Russia, then at least the shtetl. And it's in this spirit of honest, albeit humorous disillusionment that he wrote his Altnai Kozrilivka, the Old New Kozrilivka, a parodic Baedeker that includes 7 sections in decreasing order of desirability. Transportation, hotels, restaurants, liquor, theater, fires, and bandits. So Gogol's tales of the fair are equally dangerous. There are also fires, there are also bandits. But if Sholem Aleichem's stories have the Jew as sort of increasingly at risk, in Gogol's commercial landscape, the Jew and other outsiders cause the danger in the stories. So to get back to the folktale that I was telling you earlier, the folktale embedded within the story of the Sorochinsky Fair, this is about a terrifying reproduction of marketplace matter. And in this case, the marketplace matter that reproduces itself is a devil's red coat. So as I was telling you, Hrytsko, in order to win back Paraska, has to orchestrate the telling of this scary folk story. And he does this by catching Cherevik, the potter, when he's drinking in a tavern, and having someone tell this story about a devil. And the story goes like this. An errant devil who had somehow been kicked out of hell lands in Sorochinsky and takes to drink. He goes into debt and has to pawn his beautiful red cloak to a Jew that was selling vodka at the time in Sorochinsky. Well, he promises to return in a year's time, and the Jew promises to hold on to it, but of course he can't help himself because it has such beautiful fabric, better fabric than you can even find in Mirgorod. And so he sells it to a passing Polish gentleman. Well, everyone except, interestingly enough, the Jew who possesses this cloak has terrible luck in trade. So everyone's sort of fobbing it off on the next person. The Pole fobs it off on some sort of, petty merchant at the fair, and then eventually it lands in the hands of an upstanding peasant selling dairy products. And the peasant has the power to take the red cloak, chop it up into pieces, and it, of course, reforms into the shape of a coat again, sort of like in Terminator 2. But then he chops it up again, and he sprinkles them all around the fair. And ever since, the devil has returned to the Soroczyn, to this day, the devil has returned to the Soroczyn fair in the form of a pig, sniffing around and looking for his lost scraps of red jacket. So that's the story in a nutshell that is told to scare Cherevik, and it works. Gogol, through this story, is dramatizing the relationship between the human soul and the material that threatens it. This ubiquitous red cloth would continue to reproduce itself in other forms, in other stories by Gogol, and it appears perhaps in its final form on the back of Chichikov in Dead Souls as a cranberry-colored coat. And of course, Chichikov also has a sort of pig-like presence and is going around collecting the lost souls of the Russian Empire. For Gogol, this kind of comic, devilish object subtly draws the reader's attention to more pressing ethical questions. As Mikhail Bakhtin has reminded us, Chichikov's purchasing of dead peasants and dead souls gives the reader a more accurate view of the real images and processes of the serf economy, the buying and selling of human beings. Well, for Gogol, the dangers lurking at the depths of the Soroczyn fair exist in part due to Jews and other foreigners, whose marketplace presence in 19th century Eastern Europe seemed to represent the dark side of capitalism. Jews often appeared at the time in 19th century Russian, Polish, and Ukrainian literature as spies, Polish spies, middlemen, keepers of the keys to churches, and so forth. But here we have to return to the notion of the fortress empire, a space that aspires to being sealed closed, but actually has these penetrable borders. Things leak in, and this is very threatening. The Soroczyn fair is a moral lesson about the dangers of overzealous trade and also about the dangers of foreign goods. The Jew is invariably the negative example. He's the perennial foreigner. There's an implied kinship in the story between pigs, devils, and Jews. In fact, the Jew is punished in the story for selling the coat. Just as he begins to pray, he is to pray in the Jewish fashion, po-żydowsky. He is haunted by pig snouts that poke in at his windows. So he's sort of punished for selling the coat with the least kosher of animals. But recall that this whole frightening tale of Jews and devils is being told by Hrycko to Cherevik in order to get his beloved back. It works. Cherevik is scared out of his wits. He runs out of the tavern, loses consciousness, loses track of his wares, and when he regains consciousness, Hrycko magically appears with his products and with buyers for his products because he has saved the day. Hrycko promises him the daughter, and everyone celebrates at a wedding, which may or may not be a happy ending for the two. You can decide for yourselves. Depends on your interpretation of Gogol. Gogol's introduction of Jewish characters into his Ukrainian texts both increases this sensation of a tale being told from the margins of the Russian Empire, and it also introduces this danger of foreign penetration. Jews play a similar role in other stories by Nikolai Gogol. Taras Bulba is the most obvious example. The Cossacks are drawn into battle in this novel by outrage against blasphemous religious combination. And here you can look at quote 5 on your handout. "Hang all the Jews," rang out from the crowd. "Don't let their Jewesses sew skirts out of our priests' garments." The Jewish women who make skirts out of Orthodox priests' vestments are turning religious garb into commonplace material, an act that assumes a connection between the Jew and Ukrainian culture and commercial pragmatism, and also anti-Christianity. Well, the Jews in Taras Bulba, while despised, can still negotiate magically between the hero and his goals. Having spared the Jew Yankel his life, Taras continues to encounter the Jew, and the latter magically appears to negotiate difficult situations for the right price. It's Yankel who informs Taras about his son Andriy when he has gone off and fallen in love with a Polish princess, thereby deserting his Cossack brethren. It's also Yankel who helps Taras to see his other son, Ostap, when he's been captured by Poles and is about to be hanged. So Yankel is a professional intervener with links through Jewish communities in Polish territories. Well, I want to move on now to how Sholem Aleichem is critiquing this, how he is taking Gogol's Jewish cosmopolitans and turning them on their heads. Sholem Aleichem's characters are not powerful negotiators. In fact, they are usually failures at trade, as was Sholem Aleichem for that matter. They're absolutely ill-equipped to navigate the Russian Empire. And a key example is the protagonist in Sholem Aleichem's 1901 The Haunted Little Tailor, Der Verkischefte Schneider. Shimon Elia Shema Kolenu, whose nickname literally means, Simon, my God, hear our voice, is as ineffectual and henpecked as Solopy Cherevik of the Soroczyncy Fair. He saved up enough money to buy his wife a milk goat, which she's been wanting for a very long time, and he travels from his hometown, Zlodayevka, which, for those of you who are Slavic language speakers, you know that it means something like evil town. And he travels from Zlodayevka to Kozadayevka, which means something like goat town or goat milking town, to buy a milk goat. And he has to navigate this town's unfamiliar marketplace. As he enters, he hears market women shouting to one another in Ukrainian, which is an overture to his own imminent confusion. Check out quote 6 on your handout. This one I will read in the Ukrainian. And by the way, Sholem Aleichem includes it in transliterated Ukrainian in his Yiddish text. Czujesz, a що тобі за курка? Яка курка? Це пивена на курка. Нехай буде пивена, а що тобі за курка? Listen, how much for the hen? What hen? This is a rooster, not a hen. So let it be a rooster. Well, how much for the hen? And so forth. So recall the sights and sounds in Gogol's Soroczyncy that overwhelm Paraska and Cherevik when they first enter this fair. Shimon Eli is similarly hypnotized by the goat market. Take a look at quote 7 as well. 2 steps further was the courtyard, synagogue courtyard, where old women sat over tubs and sold pears, sunflower seeds, and beans, where teachers were giving lessons and children shouted, and goats without end, jumped, pulled at straw from the houses, or sat on the ground with their combed-out beards, warming themselves in the sun and chewing their cud. Well, the goat market is the beginning of the enchantment or haunting, the kishuf, that Shimon Eli will experience and that will actually be his downfall. The milk goat that Shimon Eli ends up procuring, and it's a perfectly good milk goat, has too much power over him. En route home to Zlodayevka, to his hometown of Evil Town, Shimon Eli is tempted to stop at a tavern which is kept by a distant relative of his, Dodi. And he goes in and he takes a drink and he takes another drink. Well, Dodi has never loved Shimon Eli because Shimon Eli is a bit of a braggart and he's a little bit too proud of his Jewish learning. What Shimon Eli lacks in Jewish learning, he makes up for with practical knowledge about goats. So while Shimon Eli is drunk, Dodi goes out in the back, switches the milk goat for a male goat. Shimon Eli goes on his merry way in the morning. But when he arrives in his hometown, Zlodayevka, what had been an angel of a goat in Kozadayevka is a devil and incapable of producing milk. He goes back angrily, wants to swap the goat again in Kozadayevka. Of course, he stops at Dodi's tavern one more time. Dodi switches them. He gets to Kozadayevka. It's a perfect angel. This happens a couple of times. So Dodi renders the tailor's plight increasingly ridiculous. Well, like Gogol's Cherevik, who's duped into believing the story of the devil and the coat, and runs about madly and eventually gets tied up and is accused of stealing his own products, Shimon Elia is pursued by visions of the goat and runs around frightened and eventually passes out. Take a look at quote 8. Shimon Elia tried to step forward and the goat followed him. He turned right, the goat turned right. He turned left and the goat turned left. Shema Yisrael, Shimon Elia cried out with a voice not his own and broke into a run. And as he ran, it seemed someone was chasing him, mocking him in a thin, goatish little voice, speaking like a human and singing like a cantor, ruler of life and death who revives the dead. Well, unlike Cherevik's temporary madness in the Soroczyncy Fair, the tailor's insanity leads to his untimely death. Shimon Elia, in keeping with Jewish tradition, does manage to shout out Shema Israel, hero Israel, the words that are to be on a Jew's lips when he dies. However, note that his plural epithet, Shema Kolenu, suggests that maybe this utterance and therefore this death belongs not just to him but to his entire community. And indeed, ignorant of Dodi's trick, the entire town of Zlodeyevkins armed themselves to take revenge on their neighboring Kazadeyevkins. Here turn to quote 9. They gathered about 60 volunteers, tailors, shoemakers, carpenters, blacksmiths, and butchers, strong youths, one and all, armed with the tools of their trade, a wooden yardstick, an iron, a heel of a boot. Someone grabbed an axe, someone else took a hammer, and others had simple household paraphernalia, a rolling pin, a fish scaler, or a carving knife, and it was decided that they should go straight to war with the Kazadeyevkins, to kill, conquer, vanquish them once and for all. So the tale ends as something of a critique of a fragmented Jewish community, whose members misdirect their frustrations against one another. Well, there is a second precedent for Sholem Aleichem's story, and that is the revolutionary writer Maxim Gorky, who notoriously disliked peasants, a fact that may account for how little he evoked the commercial landscape in his writings. One exception is his 1897 The Fair in Goltva, Yarmark of Goltva, which was published just a couple of years before Sholem Aleichem's The Haunted Little Tailor, and set in a market town very near Gogol's native Sorochinsky. Well, Gorky introduces the landscape of the shtetl very similarly to the way that Sholem Aleichem and Gogol do, complete with churches and crosses that look like torches burning with a bright flame. And he also has Gogolian commercial archetypes. A key difference is that whereas Gogol's Ukrainian characters are at the center of the story, with gypsies and Jews somewhere out on the periphery, Gorky's groups are introduced as competitors at a bargaining table, with Ukrainian terms marking Ukrainian peasants in the story as particularly provincial and ignorant. Here turn to quote 10 on your handout. Everywhere folks, choloviki, throng, argue, and bawl. It takes 10 yukis, chochli, to utter the same number of words per minute that it takes 3 Jews talking for the same amount of time. But 3 Jews will say in that same minute no more than 1 gypsy can. If you were to compare it to something, you might say that a yuki is a cannon, a Jew a rapid-fire rifle, and a gypsy a machine gun. Well, in the first episode in this story, a gypsy swindles a slow Ukrainian character out of his horse several times. There are these ever-present crosses above the marketplace on the church, and they effectively rob the peasants of their competitive edge by compelling the Ukrainians to cross themselves before sealing a deal. A superstitious habit of which the gypsies take full advantage. Here turn to quote 11. I like the man. I want to do good by the man. Мне человек нравится. Я хочу человеку доброе сделать. Little uncle, pray to the Lord. Well, the yuki, the Gogol, takes off his hat and they both devoutly cross themselves before the church. As the peasant turns to face the cross, the gypsy easily switches the horse for a worse horse, and they have to keep bargaining back and forth. So like the hapless Shimon Elia in The Enchanted Tailor, the Ukrainian is just a little bit too pious and not quite wise enough in livestock to keep up with his counterpart at the bargaining table. It's likely that Sholem Aleichem drew the device of swapping animals directly from this story. As we know, Sholem Aleichem at root is a great imitator, and Gorky had made a powerful impression on Sholem Aleichem in the early 1900s. Asher Balin, the Yiddish literary critic and writer, had left Russia in 1903, and he returned to Kiev for a visit in 1904. He claims that Sholem Aleichem had completely redecorated his study. Balin writes, Gogol's portrait had disappeared from the wall, and his beloved Gogol box, his Gogol Kestel, had likewise disappeared from the desk. And in place of dead souls, I found the books of contemporary Russian writers, especially Maxim Gorky. Sholem Aleichem's appearance also seemed updated. He had grown much younger and more democratic. His Gogol look, der Gogol Oisen, had disappeared, and his Gorky look had emerged. Well, other accounts and pictures from the early 1900s have Sholem Aleichem dressing as Gorky did in a long, loose Tolstoyan peasant shirt with a high collar. There's a picture of this on your handout, and as you'll notice, he really was quite successful. You'll recall from Fiddler on the Roof and from the Tevye stories that Hava's beloved Ukrainian, Kvietska, is compared to a second Gorky. Sholem Aleichem had met Gorky in St. Petersburg in 1904, The Kishinev pogrom, which happened in 1903, had led Sholem Aleichem to seek alliances with Russian political writers like Gorky and Korolenko, and it also led Gorky to seek alliances with Jewish writers. Well, during their first meeting, Gorky, who was then the director of Znania, the publishing company, Knowledge, asked Sholem Aleichem if he would edit a collection of Yiddish stories in Russian. We have no idea what became of this collection, by the way. If anyone knows, please tell me. I don't think it was ever produced, but in a letter to his children afterwards, Sholem Aleichem refers to Gorky as an idol, an upgot. Well, the fair at Goltva is among Gorky's least tendentious works, but it is not difficult to extract a social message from the story. Misplaced superstition prevents a community from reaping material benefit. The peasants are convenient dupes in the story, and they're willful slaves to a useless church. Early reviews suggest that Gorky had the ear of a Russian readership that looked down on what they viewed to be an easily manipulable Ukrainian peasantry. In 1901, the critic Vladimir Batsianovsky wrote, "A great Russian himself, Gorky depicts Yukis beautifully. Прекрасно пишет хохлов." Note that although Nikolai Gogol called himself a chochol, the derogatory term for a Ukrainian in his letters, he never uses the term in his Ukrainian stories. Whereas Gogol's Sorochinsky Fair can be interpreted to an extent as an idealization of peasant life, Gorky is using an almost identical commercial landscape to underline the foolishness and superstition of the peasantry. And he's using a Gogolian fair to expose a significant social ill, which is perpetrated in large part by antiquated tradition. Well, Gorky names his most important archetypal borrowing in his story. This is quote 12. A young Jew with a box at his chest shouts, "Romanian tobacco, gentleman's tobacco, strong tobacco. The devil smoked it and it killed his wife." Now this is some good tobacco if it can kill off a wife, observed a certain Solopy Cherevik. The Solopy Cherevik, Paraska's kindly, simple-minded father, whom we recall a gypsy together with Hrytsko had manipulated into appearing as though he'd stolen his own horse, has wandered into Gorky's fair in search of an antidote for his own nagging wife, Hivria. The devil, albeit still in anecdotal form, seems to be roaming from fair to literary fair, haunting or helping the locals. The critic N. Stiechkin, writing in 1904, sees the fair at Goltva as evidence of Gorky's failure throughout the rest of his literary oeuvre. The story, he writes, gives us a sense of what the author could have been had he not devoted himself to the tendentious sermons of misery and ruin. To set about describing a little Russian country fair on the banks of the Psyol after Gogol's Sorochinsky Fair is courageous. Well, rather than replacing Gogol, as Balin has proposed, Gorky seems to have helped Sholem Aleichem to form his critique of Gogol. And Sholem Aleichem's critique of Gogol is far harsher than Gorky's. In The Haunted Little Tailor, the Jews of the neighboring Kazadeyevka are blamed for Dodi's prank in a manner that is not unlike the practice of blaming Jews for the unrest in Russia's borderlands. Sholem Aleichem is thus critiquing the scapegoating of a community, and he's rejecting an ideology that was firmly in place in the Dikanka stories in the Sorochinsky Fair, where the outsider, and from Gogol's perspective, specifically the Jew, is blamed for the dissemination of evil. Shimon Elia, who closely resembles Gogol's Cherevik, is mistaken in blaming the Kazadeyevkans. Other stories of Sholem Aleichem's reveal Kazadeyevkans to be scapegoats, as their name would suggest, for other Jewish communities. The Great Panic of the Little People is a novella that's actually labeled poema in the fashion of Gogol's Dead Souls, and this takes place in the shtetl Kazdrilivke, whose residents believe that instead of horns, the Kazadeyevka goats have, quote, an odd kind of chachka that looks a bit like a phylactery, if you'll forgive the comparison. So not only are the oft-scapegoated Kazadeyevkans connected to goats, their goats even resemble Jews, a fitting detail in a story that deals, albeit cautiously, with Ukrainian anti-Semitism. Well, in this story, both towns, Kazadeyevka and Kazrilivka, are frightened by rumors of an approaching pogrom. They flee. Each, of course, flees to the other town. They meet in the middle. And the reader, who has witnessed the outbreak of a new series of pogroms, watches the characters retreat with apprehension. If there's a refuge for the Kazrilivkans and the Kazadeyevkans, it does not appear to be in Ukraine. Well, what is the upshot of all of this? Sholem Aleichem writes primarily for and about Jews. He's writing in Yiddish, after all. But the interaction between many communities of Jews is modeled on interactions in the more complex and multi-ethnic world that he observes. Whereas Gogol relegates Jews to the margins of his stories, in Sholem Aleichem it is Ukrainian and Russian characters who tend to lurk on the periphery. And whereas Gogol's heavily caricatured Jew is a marketplace expert, closely tied to pigs and other marketplace products and profiting against all odds from the coat in the Stroum Center and also from war in Taras Bulba, Rabinovich's characters, like the author, tend to be failures at trade. The author, by the way, lost all of his money on the Kiev stock market. So the Yiddish writer works to dispel the myth so often perpetrated in Russian literature that Jews profit at the expense of their Slavic neighbors. Shimon Elia can quote from the Torah, but he can't tell a male from a female goat. We see this with other characters as well, especially with the Menachem Mendel stories, even with Tevye and so forth. Well, if the devilish coat in the Soroczynski fair reflects in part Gogol's fear of those capitalist ventures in which Jews are understood to be complicit that threaten the Slavic soul, then for Sholem Aleichem, the Ukrainian marketplace, an increasingly frequent site of violence against Jews in the early 20th century, represents a more immediate physical danger. Although Gogol never intended for his prose to be a tool for modernizing Russia's Jewish subjects, his stories, which were particularly popular when Sholem Aleichem was writing, had a powerful influence on his self-proclaimed Yiddish apprentice. By rewriting Gogol's Jewish characters, Sholem Aleichem provides a strong critique not only of Gogol's literary ideology, but of the kind of scapegoating of Jews that had escalated in the Tsarist Empire in the 1880s. But there's something else here that Sholem Aleichem is doing. He's observing the horror embedded within Gogol's Ukrainian stories, which is something that few early critics noticed. Bakhtin would notice this just a few years later. Mikhail Bakhtin's approach to the literary marketplace is most commonly understood to be positive, based on his discussion of Rabelaisian catharsis, but early notes on Gogolian laughter show us the danger underlying Gogol's comedy. Bakhtin writes, a school of nightmares and horror, the funny fiends, the smeshnie strashilishe in Gogol, the plague and laughter in Boccaccio, the funny fiends in the Soroczynski fair. Well, these funny fiends from the Soroczynski fair to dead souls are what I think drew Sholem Aleichem into Gogol's marketplace. But rather than being in league with the fiends, as Gogol's Jews were, Sholem Aleichem's characters are in danger of being hurt by the fiendishness of the Russian Empire. Well, it's no surprise that Gogol would have been dismissed by Jewish readers, from Shimon Dubnov to the Soviet critic S. Mashinsky, as one of Russia's many literary anti-Semites. Nonetheless, Sholem Aleichem was borrowing first a formal trope of exchange within literature, second, a commercial landscape as a microcosm of the Pale of Settlement, and most importantly, the careful masking of danger, both physical and spiritual, through laughter. Sholem Aleichem himself narrowly escaped a pogrom in 1905 in Kiev. He left Ukraine with his family for Europe and later the United States. He would never settle in the Ukrainian territories again. His readers knew all too well that the marketplace, like all of laughter culture, was dangerous. And Gogol's fair, as attested by the red coat, is riddled with evil. The devil calls attention to this, but the evil remains even after the devil and the folk story disappear. The wedding that concludes the Soroczynski fair is less a celebration of the young people's love than it is a kind of terrifying marriage of these marketplace types. There's a fiddler who transforms the crowd into a scene of unity and harmony, and this includes old women with death masks that bob up and down like marionettes, showing the indifference of the tomb. That's a quote. This final dance, which absorbs the individual into a kind of soulless ubiquity of the market crowd, reveals what I think is Gogol's struggle between the laughter provoked by material objects and the spirit which is threatened by the presence of these material objects. Bergson, in probing the inevitable union of matter and spirit, has proposed that whilst introspection reveals to us the distinction between matter and spirit, it also bears witness to their union. And Gogol's narrator, frustrated by precisely this union that Bergson points out, leaves us on an abrupt note of dissatisfaction. And here you have quote 13. Is it not thus that joy, lovely and fleeting guest, flies from us, and in vain the last solitary note tries to express gaiety? Heavy and sorrowful is his heart, and nothing can help it. So So the joy of this collective memory space is always necessarily accompanied by the tragic awareness of materiality and loss. And, interestingly enough, Hivria, the stepmother who never wanted the marriage to take place, seems to be right. It seems that Paraska, by getting married, is catapulted into the future much faster than she might otherwise have been. Well, if Gogol turns from laughter abruptly to tears at the end of his story, Sholem Aleichem turns from tears abruptly to laughter at the end of his own story. Having left his haunted Tailor to a tragic end, Sholem Aleichem's narrator employs his own model of bittersweet comedy to depart from his story. And here you have quote 14. The tale began joyfully, but it ended, like so many joyful stories, oy vey, very tragically. And since you know the storyteller is not a sullen type, and that he prefers laughter to tears, and since you know he dislikes moralizing and that preaching is not his way, let us laugh as we take leave of one another. Well, this bittersweet ending may look similar to Gogol's, but I want to reiterate again that it's actually the inverse. Gogol, with his conservative tendencies, mourns the loss of the pure. Sholem Aleichem is, like Gorky, far more pragmatic, and his unexpected, even disturbing optimism leaves us on a note of desiring change. Well, the Yiddish writer is said to have kept a Yiddish translation of Gogol's Laughter Through Tears passage on his desk. The citation is on your handout. It's number 15. I won't read it, but you have it. On May 15th, 1916, when Solomon Rabinovich, Sholem Aleichem, was buried in the Mount Nebuch Cemetery in Cypress Hills, Queens, his headstone was inscribed with his original epitaph. And the closing stanza again recapitulates Gogol's laughter through tears motif. But this time it would seem that tears are emphasized over laughter. This is quote 16. And just as the public was laughing, chortling, and making merry, he suffered, this only God knows, in secret so that no one should see. Und aufgedämmelt, wenn der Eulen hat gelacht, geklatscht und pflegt sich freien, hat gekränkt, das weiß nur Gott, so das keiner soll nicht sehen. Well, I read this as a split desire in Sholem Aleichem, a kind of longing to preserve a Jewish past even as he's pushing for necessary change. If Yiddish literature could be a means of Jewish enlightenment, then Jewish enlightenment could also ultimately destroy Yiddish literature. And this is what I think gave Sholem Aleichem a fear of loss that he would take with him quite literally to the grave. He no longer saw Yiddish as a means to the end goal of modern Jewish nationalism, but rather it had become a kind of end in itself, though his readers, like his characters, wouldn't remain with Yiddish much longer than they would remain in the shtetl. So if the fair represented for Sholem Aleichem the Jewish Pale of Settlement, then the author's unfinished autobiographical From the Fair, Von dem Yarid, which was written in New York, is a tribute to his journey, not only, as he states, away from his profession, but also away from the great fair that had been the Russian Empire.
Thank you.
Thank you.